Welcome all followers of the Undying Glow to this week's sermon by your favorite irradiated dude, where we are looking at special souls in Adam's sight, the Ghouls. Ghouls have featured in every single Fallout game to date. They seem to be as much a part of Fallout's DNA as anything else, because from their very first appearance in the first Fallout, their lore has been expanded to a truly impressive level. This is the first half of a full treatment of ghouls within the Fallout series, with a specific emphasis on looking at how each game portrays, changes, expands, or retcons previous ghoul lore. Going chronologically, this will examine what I call the Interplay period. That is everything up to Fallout 3, and the Bethesda era will be done in a second video. It is one thing to know the lore of any given thing within the Fallout series, and another thing to know how the lore has evolved, and what the creators were trying to tell us and show us about ghouls as a group, as individuals, and how they survive in their corner of the wasteland. So, crank up the rads and slough off some skin as we explore the complete lore of ghouls in the Fallout series. Fallout, the game that started it all. What a great game. Much of what came to define the Fallout series and set it apart from other post-apocalyptic worlds got its start here, and well, that makes sense. It is the first game after all. Most players, long before they ever see or speak to what we have come to know and love as ghouls, they will most likely hear some juicy tidbits from other NPCs. The settlement of Junktown has two people that will warn the player of both ghouls and the place that they call home. Tycho, one of the great companions of the first Fallout, tells the player that ghouls live in a place called Necropolis and explains that these ghouls seem human but are far different. Necropolis, which in Greek means City of the Dead, was further explained by Tycho when he said, "The City of Death is well named. It is now home to ghouls and worse." Killian Darkwater is the mayor of Junktown and confirms that it is a City of Death because he has lost two patrols that he sent in that direction. None of this bodes well, and definitely builds up Necropolis and its ghoul inhabitants as being an especially dangerous and mysterious place. Necropolis cannot be avoided, even if you really did want to heed Tycho's and Killian's warnings, because a critical quest item can only be found there. The water chip, which is needed to fix the Vault 13 water filtration system, can only be found at Necropolis, and so willingly or not, everyone has to set foot inside the City of the Dead to finish the main quest. A few things are immediately apparent when the Vault Dweller first enters Necropolis. The background picture of the local map is looking pretty rough, but hey, it's the apocalypse. What do you expect? And there are hordes of slouched green humanoid creatures in tattered clothing, shambling about aimlessly. They don't seem to say anything either, grunting, growling, and making all manner of other guttural or animalistic sounds. Inspecting some of these ghouls reveals that they seem to have been human once, or at least descended from humans. The Vault Dweller guesses that the deterioration of the body could be the result of acid or radiation. Getting close to try and speak with the shambling ghouls causes them to become hostile when you get close, although they are not much of a threat. They walk slowly and don't cover too much distance, and only attack with their fists, doing very little damage. These ghouls seem to only be a concern when fighting a bunch at once, and they have such low perception that they are quite easy to run past without engaging in combat. If this description starts to make you think of zombies, well, that seems to be intended. A random encounter around Necropolis has the Vault Dweller encounter a few ghouls, and they are described as skinny, hostile humanoids who shuffle up to the player to attack with their hands. But observing them in-game will lead to the game describing them as zombie guards. Another random encounter will show the result of a battle or raid on a merchant caravan with multiple dead bodies, some dead merchants, and a dead ghoul caravan guard. Once again, the game labels the dead ghoul guard as a zombie guard. The one up close and personal view of a ghoul that we get is a ghoul leader named Set, who gets a talking head. We see that ghouls are missing skin, showing bones and ligaments underneath, missing features like noses or ears, and even have empty space in their chest cavities. There appears to be some sort of strange scarification, like what can be seen over his right eye, and his left eye is dark red. Much of the skin is also colorless or green, looking like it is either dead or gangrenous, appearing deeply necrotic. There are two other in-game observations regarding ghouls that reinforce these zombie similarities. One is as follows: the body of the humanoid looks to be highly irradiated, but still functioning. While it was once human, it seems to have reverted to a more animalistic lifestyle. And another: much of the muscle and brain matter seems to have deteriorated. However, genetic indicators lead you to believe that it descended, like you, from those that entered the vaults. Set, the leader I just mentioned, will also not talk to the player unless it's evening or nighttime, seeming to have a strong preference towards operating at night, not too unlike popular portrayals of zombies. It seems clear that many physical and some behavioral aspects of ghouls were inspired by zombies, even if that term itself is used sparingly. But even with the obvious parallels, ghouls are much cooler than your run-of-the-mill zombie. At first, it seems like Necropolis is just several groups of hostile, slow, unintelligible creatures that look like they have just been doused in acid or radiation. Exploration reveals that the only way to get to other parts of the city is through the underground tunnels, where another group of ghouls are found, but these ones are different. Upon first encounter, a ghoul leader asks the vault dweller not to shoot them and engages in dialogue. Although these ghouls have the same appearance as those above, they not only speak and emote, but they reveal that there are some complex politics at play with the ghouls that live within the city. They are split into two main factions, one on the surface of Necropolis that is led by a violent and vindictive leader named Set, and this group down in the sewers and tunnels that are far more peaceful and disagree with Set and how he governs. A current crisis revolves around water. The settlement's water pump has broken, and they are only able to get clean, purified water, or what they call the flow, in almost religious reverence, from what they call the deep. Deep below the surface of the city is Vault 12, and it is the source of the ghouls' life-giving water, and where the only water chip in this part of the wasteland can be found. Things are even more complicated though, since these surface ghouls under Set have been forced into an uneasy truce with occupying supermutants because their leader, the Master, ordered the supermutants to establish a base. The base of Set's ghouls on the surface is called both the Temple by some surface ghouls or the Hall of the Dead by Set and some of those close to him. It is unknown whether all these names like Hall of the Dead and Necropolis come from human outsiders giving these names due to fear and discrimination, or if the ghouls themselves came up with these names. It is also possible that outsiders gave ghouls and the settlement of Necropolis their names, and the ghouls just embraced them as a way to remove the negative meanings behind them. Dialogue with a peculiar character named Harold, who we will get to more a little later, makes it clear that the ghouls seem insistent on using the term ghoul. When asked about them, Harold corrects the vault dweller, who used the word ghoul by saying,
"Mutants, doesn't matter what they call themselves."
That sentence alone makes it seem like ghouls named themselves, rather than outsiders. The ghouls have names that they use for humans in return though. Set will refer to the vault dweller as Normie, Bloodbag, and Walker. The second one seems to imply that ghouls don't have blood in the same way humans do, and the last one, Walker, seems to imply that ghouls can't walk like humans can. Set will also say himself that ghouls are the future, as they can survive anywhere and therefore are much better adapted than humans for the new irradiated world. Supermutants seem to agree that they think ghouls are tougher or somehow more capable than humans as well. The ghoul superiority complex, all these nicknames, and the way that ghouls treat the vault dweller reflect the tense relationship between ghouls and humans, although they do have some limited interaction. We know of some merchants that will travel to Necropolis to trade, and there is even another former Vault 13 dweller who had ventured to Necropolis before the player character. Not all ghouls will talk to the Vault dweller, and many of those that do will only speak to them for a short time or tell them to leave them and Necropolis alone. Most those on the surface that will engage in dialogue all speak quite strangely, either using symbolic language and metaphors like with Set, or speaking a language akin to Creole, like in the case of the hotel manager. These dialects may have developed as a result of their insular community, similar to how some real-world groups went on to develop their own languages, like Yiddish. It should be pointed out, however, that there are entire groups of ghouls who do not demonstrate any ability to communicate. The groups of ghouls that roam the surface will only grunt. There are a couple of what are called glowing ones at the entrance of the underground Vault 12 who are deemed mad by the rest of the ghouls because they violently lash out at everyone, and the in-game descriptions mention some ghouls seem to have reverted to a more animalistic lifestyle. This seems to describe a wild or feral kind of state, one where necrotic degeneration has reached its most extreme, but it is never referred to as such in the game. It is worth noting, however, that the groups that appear to be feral on the surface of Necropolis can apparently still follow orders. When the Vault Dweller agrees to help Set get rid of the super mutants that are occupying the water pump house, he says that he will not send word to all his ghouls to leave the player alone, just in case word would make it to the super mutants and tip them off to the plan. This would imply that the shamblers around Necropolis can receive and listen to orders, so would that make them truly feral? There are two NPCs in the Southern California wasteland that make the story of ghouls even more peculiar. Harold is an old soul, having weathered the Great War in the Vault and later becoming a merchant and explorer in the post-war years. He and Richard Gray explored a mysterious pre-war facility called the Mariposa Military Base, where Richard fell into a vat of forced evolutionary virus, or FEV, and would go on to become the main antagonist of Fallout called the Master. Harold would be knocked out by the same robotic arm, only coming 2 days later outside the base when he was already starting to change and mutate. His in-game sprite is the same as a ghoul, and a close-up look when engaging in dialogue makes him look just like a ghoul as well. Similar to Set, his skin is green. He's missing body parts like his nose or ears. You can see straight to his bone or even through his ribcage. And perhaps coincidentally, his right eye is gone and grown over with scar tissue, just like Set. He is, by all appearances, a ghoul that has been alive for much longer than the normal human lifespan. When he is asked why he mutated, and if it could have been due to radiation, he says he doesn't know, and says it must have been something from the military base, which we know has one of the greatest concentrations of FEV anywhere on the West Coast. Another man named Tallius came from Vault 13 to solve the Vault's water issues before the main character set out on the adventure that kickstarts the story. And Tallius went to Necropolis after hearing about their ability to pump purified water. The super mutants were relative newcomers to Necropolis themselves at the time, and the ghouls and super mutants were actively fighting each other. Tallius helped the ghouls in their fight against the super mutants, but ended up being captured by the super muties and was exposed to FEV, which began a mutation process. He didn't turn into a super mutant like they were hoping, rather he mutated in a unique way that looks just like a ghoul. Unfortunately, we don't get to see a close-up of Tallius like we do with Harold, but an in-game observation when the Vault Dweller first meets him says, "You see a hideous ghoul." But Tallius will never refer to himself as a ghoul, rather some sort of mutant. So we are left with two interesting cases, one of Tallius, who is exposed to FEV and mutated into either a ghoul or something that looks just like it, and the other case, Harold, has him also mutating from an unknown source into something that looks exactly like a ghoul with greatly prolonged life. It is most likely that Harold owes his mutations to FEV since the military base was just drowning in it, but we just don't know. This leads us to consider whether FEV plays a role in the process of becoming a ghoul, or if it is just a coincidental form of mutation. So we have what I will call the normal ghouls that are most commonly seen, a potential FEV ghoul in Harold and Tallius, as well as glowing ones who are glowing due to an extreme amount of radiation. Like with almost all Fallout locations, Necropolis gets a number of possible endings depending on the player's actions, but we know which of these endings are canon. Due to the actions of the Vault Dweller, killing the super mutants in Necropolis in order to get access to the pump house, a new group of super mutants were sent to Necropolis to raze the settlement to the ground. And in doing so, they killed many ghouls and scattered almost everyone else to the wasteland. So things look very bad for the one single settlement and concentration of ghouls in this part of the wasteland. Even with all this information about one of Fallout's most important locations and memorable groups, we are left with so many questions and assumptions. We are never told where the ghouls actually come from and why they are only found in Necropolis, and nowhere else in the wasteland. Their proximity, use, and partial occupation of Vault 12 in the absence of anyone else means that they could come from the vault, but information is hard to come by because the ghouls are so isolated and untrusting of outsiders. All the ghouls seem concentrated in Necropolis, so is it really the only place for hundreds of miles where ghouls can be found? Does that mean ghouls only came from Necropolis, or did ghouls from elsewhere migrate to Necropolis to escape persecution? If all or most of the ghouls came from Necropolis itself, what was so special about that area to produce ghouls? Are Harold and Talius ghouls? And if so, does that mean FEV is needed to create a ghoul along with radiation? Did ghouls give themselves that name and embrace the whole death motif, or was that foisted on them by others? As just a quick aside, some Fallout concept art shows what seems to be an early version of a ghoul, but is called a Bloodman. I like this design, and just wanted to mention it. Fallout 2 is the next game and source of information for ghouls in the Fallout series, taking place almost 100 years after the events of Fallout and covering some of the same geographic areas as well. Once again, we see ghouls, and luckily Fallout 2 does a good job in expanding their lore. Similar to how ghouls were only seen in one settlement in the previous game, ghouls are primarily found in two settlements in Fallout 2, the town of Gecko and the mining town of Broken Hills. Whereas the ghouls in Necropolis were borderline or just outright hostile to the player, the ghouls in Fallout 2 are more often than not willing to talk to the Chosen One and are friendly. There are also a lot more named ghoul characters, where Fallout only had 2. Fallout 2 now has 17. Fallout 2 also shows a lot more diversity of thought amongst the ghouls, who they are, why they are the way they are, and what, if anything, can be done about it. Gecko is a unique town because it has sprung up around a pre-war nuclear reactor that survived the Great War and successfully shut itself down to avert disaster. The game, manuals, and guides are not specific about when ghouls started to gather in and around the nuclear plant, but enough ghouls settled in this place that they were able to get the nuclear reactor back online. This presented the opportunity to generate power, but also caused drama with the nearby settlement of Vault City, since the nuclear reactor was not running very efficiently and was irradiating groundwater that Vault City relied on for survival. The situation is not helped at all by Vault City's incredible bigotry towards all mutants, of which ghouls are a kind of mutant, and Gecko gets all of Vault City's justified and unjustified ire. A new but quite understandable development amongst ghouls is a strange new cult, whose immediate goal at least is to find a way to reverse ghoulification and have ghouls be reborn as humans. This group is based in Gecko, is called the Renewal Cult, and has suckered in a number of ghouls, the ones that most resent or tire of being a ghoul, wishing instead to once again be a normie, as Set would say, and not subjected to the incredible discrimination that ghouls face at the hands of nearly everyone else. What makes this cult strange, though, is that it is not led by a ghoul, or a scientist, or anyone like that. It is led by a hyper-intelligent mole rat, who is mutated with FEV and is using the ghouls to his own ends. He thinks using the power generated at Gecko and the technology that Vault City possesses would give him a good foundation for his plans for world domination. He gets the ghouls to do his bidding by promising them to use Vault City's technology and medical facilities to develop a cure that would allow them to be renewed into humans once again. And he abuses this distant hope that the ghouls have for his own ends. Ghouls wishing to be human again is not the only interesting belief among the ghouls in Gecko. A smooth-talking ghoul with a rare full head of hair named Gordon, who is part of the Renewal Cult, thinks that without medical intervention, all ghouls will die within the next 20 years. There is no evidence to support this claim, and I can't think of a reason why many of these ghouls who have lived almost 200 years after the Great War would all start dying en masse within the next 20. Lastly, a special ghoul named Lenny, who was a doctor before the Great War that turned him into a ghoul. Although he was an old man when he ghoulified, the condition has brought him much longer life, and he has continued to practice as a doctor to the poor souls of Gecko. He believes that if he had access to the medical technology at Vault City, that he would be able to remove all the radiation from within ghouls, and he believes this would allow ghouls to heal. What exactly this means, we can't know for sure, but maybe he believes that ghouls could change back into humans as well. It is interesting to note that the number of ghouls that express a desire to find a cure or revert back to their human form is rather high. Has the time between Fallout and Fallout 2 increased this sentiment? Are ghouls just more open to outsiders now and willing to admit such things? Ghouls also no longer readily state that they think they are inherently superior to humans, so this seems to be a pretty large ideological shift among ghouls. Lenny the doctor we spoke of before provides some insight that may explain some of this. He was there in Necropolis when the Vault Dweller came and killed the super mutants and fixed up their pump. He speaks of how good it felt for a human to care enough about Necropolis and its ghouls to save their lives, and it made them feel like people again. Perhaps the Vault Dweller's selfless act made such an impression that it led many to reconsider their prior beliefs. It is even more impressive that Lenny has such a high opinion of the Vault Dweller because, while, yeah, he did save Necropolis, it was also their actions that led to super mutants attacking Necropolis and killing many of them. The friction between ghouls and humans were palpable in the first Fallout. Most of the ghouls don't care to speak to you, and entire groups are instantly hostile. As a player, we never really witnessed any of the discrimination between ghouls and humans, although we were the recipient of it when exploring Necropolis. Fallout 2 actually does show us the bigotry and unfair treatment in no uncertain terms. I mentioned it a bit before, but Vault City, who is filled with an inordinate amount of pricks, has an issue against mutants and anyone who is not a citizen of the city. Ghouls are strictly not allowed inside the city. They have a shoot-on-sight order for them, and they will not even trade with ghouls. So ghoul-dominated communities need to have human middlemen to help with trade interactions. And many in Vault City, primarily the first citizen Joanne Lynette, are seeking a solution to what can be called their ghoul problem. They already had paid someone to try and take care of the ghoul problem, but they can and will ask the Chosen One to go to Gecko, stop the reactor, which solves the water pollution problem, but that's not enough for them. They don't want ghouls living so close to them, and that requires taking the ghouls out, even though Vault City would actually benefit greatly from the power provided by the improved nuclear reactor. There was a man that used to live in Vault City named Lumpy, who was found to have a mutation that made him resistant to radiation. Even that was too much for Vault City, and they banished him, leaving him with few options, and he ended up in Gecko, surrounded by ghouls with a similar immunity to radiation. Broken Hills is the only other community that is populated by a significant number of ghouls, although it has a number of super mutants and even some humans to make up the most diverse of all locations in Fallout 2. Broken Hills is a mining town, mining and refining uranium to be sold to the likes of Gecko, who can then use it in their nuclear power plant. The fact that all these kinds of people can coexist and make a functional community should be an exemplary achievement, an example to the rest of the wasteland of what is possible if everyone lays prejudice aside. Unfortunately, Broken Hills has a big problem simmering beneath the surface. There is an anti-mutant conspiracy involving a number of humans who wish to rid the community of the super mutant mayor and all other mutants and thereby control the town and the profitable uranium deposits. They had previously attempted to assassinate Marcus, the town's leader, but they were thwarted by the beefy mutant, and they will try again and ask the Chosen One for help. They really hate mutants. While the player can help them successfully carry out their plot, or report them to Marcus and have them wiped out, if the player does neither of these things and just ignores the situation, the conspirators will eventually successfully wipe out all mutants. This dooms the settlement because, wouldn't you know it, having miners and workers that are immune to radiation and have incredibly long lifespans make for great uranium mine and refinery workers. Lenny, the Dr. Ghoul and Gecko can join the player as a companion, but doing so will showcase some of the bigotry throughout the wasteland. They are of course not welcome in Vault City, but even other places like the mining town of Redding will show active discrimination, where people will say awful things and you will be refused service. Although the first game went pretty far to make ghouls similar in many ways to zombies, Fallout 2 lessens it a little bit. The label zombie, however, seems to be a fairly common insult for ghouls, since if the player calls the gecko bartender Woos a zombie, he will reply, "Zombies? F*** you. We're ghouls. Zombies are a type of undead with no free will. Although we share certain physical characteristics, most notably the rotting flesh and characteristic morbidity, we are creatures of free will." We get a good amount of information related to ghouls in general because the son of Set, a ghoul named Typhon, lives in Broken Hills. Typhon was a young child when he ghoulified, but he grew up and developed into an adult, just, as a ghoul, and so he doesn't know any other life. Unlike most other ghouls who distinctly remember and miss their previous unmutated lives. Remember this bit for later. Typhon refers to him and all the ghouls around him as the first and last generation of ghouls, giving the impression that ghouls were all created in one single event, the Great War. This statement doesn't seem to be substantiated by anything else, except for the fact that of all the ghouls that will talk about their past, all of them lived in the pre-war and were ghoulified around the time of the Great War. Typhon will tell the Chosen One that he amassed a treasure of bottle caps from his days of running and winning races. This fairly mundane detail is memorable only because it is contradictory to everything we know about how ghouls can get around. They are only seen shuffling around. They derisively called humans walkers, and Lenny from Broken Hills literally says that when he saw the Vault Dweller years ago in Necropolis, he knew he wasn't a ghoul because he was running, and according to Lenny, us ghouls can't run much anymore. But as an additional twist, Lenny totally can run when recruited as a companion, so either Typhon is just telling stories, it's an inconsistency, or ghouls can actually run. One last interesting comment from Typhon is related to the prevalent mental issues that seem to plague ghouls. He believes that radiation has had deleterious effects on ghouls' brains, but he seems to imply that this is more psychological than physiological. In his mind, he is much better adjusted and suffers fewer issues than other ghouls since he has never known any other life. Fallout 2 also introduced a new ghoul model in addition to the green skin and glowing ghoul sprites. These new ones appear to be in a shredded vault suit and are white and pink, giving the impression that they are pale with exposed muscle. The in-game description actually says that these ghouls have skin that is badly burned, so ghouls can also be burned or charred decades after they ghoulified. Woos, the bartender, will also give a pretty graphic description of how ghouls are formed, which is actually the first in-depth description that we get other than simply saying radiation, and they say that like it's a bad thing. Woos confirms that a ghoul is made with severe radiation, like after the bombs went off, along with the light and heat that burned the flesh off. Does the lack of skin on ghouls indicate that their skin was burned off by nuclear blasts? Or are only the ghouls that are said in-game to have burned skin the ones lucky enough to be burned by atomic fire, but survive due to their new ghoulerific condition? Back to ghouls' brains being affected by their condition. There is a kind of ghoul that will only be encountered outside of settlements, only referred to as a crazy. They are always hostile, no matter what, and found in encounters in the wasteland. These crazed ghouls are often shown as glowing ones and have very limited dialogue. Literally the only 4 things they will say are, "Send more adventurers," "Moan," "Make the pain stop," and lastly, "Brains." Apparently, the developers weren't quite done comparing ghouls to zombies, particularly these crazed ones, although these crazed ghouls can still fight with weapons. How these ghouls ended up in this state is not known. Is it radiation? Time? The social isolation and discrimination? Ghouls are subject to severe hardships, which is best shown in 2 specific examples. So maybe it's not so surprising that some of them completely lose their minds. Woody is a ghoul that has a propensity to fall asleep randomly and for long periods of time, and his friend Percy, a ghoul and gecko, asks the Chosen One to try and find him to make sure he's okay. The Chosen One will eventually find him. He is being passed off as an Egyptian mummy by a con man named the Great Ananias, where he appears to be a dead and desiccated corpse. He has been in this state for days, or maybe even weeks, before he is woken up by the Chosen One and runs off. An even more extreme example, and what would quite literally be a nightmare, is the story of Coffin Willie, a particularly smelly ghoul. He had made his way to New Reno to drink and gamble and do standard New Reno things when he was abducted by people and taken to a graveyard called Golgotha. He was buried alive, and somehow, months after having been buried, he can be dug up by the Chosen One, and he's no worse for the wear. How was he able to survive being buried in a coffin for months without food, water, or even air? It is never explained, but ghouls seem capable of living through environments that no human possibly could. It is also worth pointing out that one new development in Fallout 2 from the first game is that the game goes to great lengths to let us know how bad ghouls stink. It makes sense that a mostly necrotic body would smell awful, but apparently the stench is awful enough that some ghouls will admit that they are even glad that their noses rotted away, otherwise they would choke on their own stench. The last interesting point that Fallout 2 makes in reference to ghouls has to do with our good old friend Harold. Harold's mutated condition in the first Fallout was ambiguous. Is he a ghoul, as the in-game observation alludes to, or something else? Once again, Fallout 2 will describe Harold when observing him in-game as a leathery and spry-looking ghoul. He will refer to the player as a smoothskin, which is Fallout's 2 new nickname that ghouls use for humans. However, Harold has something that no other ghoul does. He has started to sprout a plant out of his head. He seems pretty okay with it though, having given it a name and implying that Bob, as he calls the sapling, thinks or has feelings itself. Regardless, Harold looks much like how he did in the first Fallout, this time with a green eye. His skin is a deeper shade of green, and of course a tree is growing out of his head. However, Harold isn't the only one whose body is merging with nature in weird ways. A ghoul in Broken Hills named Eric is very sweaty, which is kind of impressive because sweat glands reside in the skin, and ghouls are all afflicted by necrosis and are losing their skin. Anyway, his sweat is somehow the perfect blend of nutrients and attractants to cause flies to swarm him and lick up that beautiful, salty ghoul sweat. Delicious. The player can help Eric with his problem by getting his dwelling more power for his air conditioning, but it is interesting to note the number of ways that ghouls and their bodies are interacting with other organisms. Harold apparently has the right kind of nutrients for a tree to grow out of his head, and Eric has the right kind of nutrients to attract and feed flies. And with that, Fallout 2 has given us unique lore, or expanded on things previously only alluded to. The player was the subject of extreme discrimination by the ghouls, because they themselves were recipients of it. But now, in Fallout 2, we see that on full display, and it is awful. Ghouls collectively no longer seem proud or consider themselves superior, since there is an entire cult and many individuals who seek to reverse ghoulification entirely. The connection to zombies is still present, and Harold's representation as a ghoul is still as strong as ever. Ghouls are able to withstand circumstances that would kill a human, like extreme radiation, weeks or months without oxygen, food, or water, but they do seem to be psychologically prone to outright hostile madness. Ghouls are also incredibly stinky. They can have conventional necrosis, they can glow, they can be dried out and withered like Woody is described to be, or they can still be burned so many years after the Great War. Fallout Tactics was the next game to release, and we get to see ghouls in a totally different geographical location. These ghouls are not connected to the first two Fallouts, so it is a good opportunity to see how much they have in common in the Midwest United States. Ghouls can be found mainly in three areas where they tend to group together. One large settlement named Quincy has a shanty town that is sometimes called the Ghoul Quarter, where all the ghouls are found, and there are tensions between the ghouls and humans. Again, a product of intense discrimination. The ghoul leader Elliot is surprised and happy to learn that the warrior treats ghouls with respect, because not many do, as is evidenced by all the anti-ghoul and anti-mutant graffiti sprayed everywhere. A bonus mission in the game has the player character, the warrior, go to the city of Springfield because anti-ghoul sentiment has reached riotous levels. The prior mayor of Springfield disappeared under suspicious circumstances, and a new one, Mayor Avalone, was put in place but started to publicly acknowledge sympathies towards the ghoul population. A group of people who opposed the new mayor's attempts to guarantee ghouls the same rights as humans formed a plot where they would overthrow the government of Springfield, but do so disguised as raiders in order to try and protect the group. The Brotherhood of Steel got word of this plot and decided to intervene, but by the time the warrior arrives at Springfield, the coup is in full swing. The plotters would be wiped out by the Brotherhood of Steel, and the mayor would be reinstated, where he would ratify what is called the Bill of Monster Rights. Some of the rights that would be preserved as part of this bill were no violence against ghouls except in self-defense, enforced payment to ghouls at a minimum of half of that of a human, and my personal favorite, which is the outlawing of certain popular sayings. These phrases all refer to pooping and include pinching the ghoul, making ghoul babies, and dropping the ghoul off at the pool. The funny thing is, as progressive as Mayor Avalon and some of Springfield's populace is, he is still only willing to say that mutants are almost people, and he seems to mostly prize the ghoul's ability to do dirty jobs that can cause unafflicted humans to get sick. The last interesting location is within Kansas City. Once again, ghouls occupy a part of the city that isolates them from everybody else, and the ghoul-only place is called Gravestone. Gravestone was founded not long after the Great War, and the ghouls that founded it were survivors that had been working in the Kansas City nuclear silos. Once again, the ghouls occupy a part of the city that isolates them from everybody else, and the ghoul-only place is called Gravestone. Gravestone was founded not long after the Great War, and the ghouls that founded it were survivors that had been working in the Kansas City nuclear silos. After the Great War, the occupants of the silos survived but were subjected to an intense amount of radiation, and many died due to radiation sickness, but those that survived turned into ghouls. At some point in the 150 years since the Great War, the ghouls developed a religion that was based on the worship of an atomic bomb that they found in the launch facilities. That sounds awfully familiar. The bomb, called Plutonius, is seen as a symbol of the supreme nuclear power, and their first bishop was a ghoul named T-. His son, who is called Defcon, currently leads the ghouls at Gravestone, who have come under siege by the super mutant army. The super mutants are assaulting the ghouls in an attempt to recover the nuclear bomb that they worship, wanting it for their own military purposes. The Brotherhood responds to the plight of the ghouls, sending the warrior and their team to Kansas City to defeat the super mutants and save the ghouls who are fighting to protect themselves and their sacred idol. What is interesting is that when the Brotherhood does beat back the super mutants, one of their demands is to be able to use Plutonius, the bomb, in their own military efforts in defeating the Calculator, as they have no other way of cracking open Vault Zero. The ghouls agree, and due to the actions of the Brotherhood of Steel in saving them at Gravestone, as well as helping them in other places like Quincy, ghouls express interest in joining the ranks of the Brotherhood of Steel, which the Brotherhood eventually allows. This ain't your grandpa's Brotherhood. Even though the Midwestern Brotherhood of Steel seems to be more accepting of mutants within their ranks, there are still many within the Brotherhood that are very bigoted, as can be seen by some of their comments, and possibly the worst offender is Commander Barnaky, who gives the player their missions in the early game. In tactics, it is very common for ghouls to lose body parts just going through their daily routine. Multiple ghouls, and especially one named Patches, are constantly talking about and joking about losing fingers, toes, ears, etc. While Fallout and Fallout 2 would mention such things happening, it was never at this level, and it seems like ghouls in the Midwest are all just literally falling to pieces. Defcon, the leader of the ghoul religion, has a tree that is growing out of his head, just like Harold in Fallout 2. So there's at least one other ghoul with this exact condition. A ghoul prisoner that can be freed from Vault Zero is known as Elaine, and she is quite interesting because she is described as looking almost human-like. While her in-game portrait certainly isn't as grotesque as many other ghoul characters, she is still very obviously a ghoul and has all the characteristics of a ghoul, except maybe the rampant necrosis that causes them to shed skin and hair. A recruitable ghoul by the name of Harold is one ugly dude with a tree growing out of his head, but this character is not the original Harold from the earlier games, rather he's just an homage to the character. Tactics leans hard into the discrimination that ghouls face in the Midwest, which is very similar to what we saw in Fallout 2. The interesting new element introduced, though, is the establishment of a large, nuclear power worshipping religion. Which, yeah, who would do that? But it is refreshing to see ghouls developing unique cultural aspects like religion, since it humanizes them in a way. Ghouls are not hostile to the player in the 3 locations that they can be found, but ghouls can be found in random encounters where they are always hostile. It isn't clear why, but perhaps these could be compared to the crazed ghouls that we can encounter in Fallout 2. From limited conversation with the ghouls that can speak to the player, all the ghouls seem to be from the Great War period, indicating, like with Fallout 2, that all or at least the overwhelming majority of ghouls were created around the time of the Great War. Interestingly, there are no glowing ones found in the game. Tactics also takes the necrosis thing very seriously, since it is a running gag across multiple characters. They are all losing body parts all over the place, and ghouls appear to be very fertile ground for agriculture. The concept art for ghouls look awesome. A lot of them seem drippy, almost like the ghouls are partially melting. Others, their skin or clothing look finely shredded and hanging off in tatters. Again, some in the concepts have right eyeballs missing, like Set and Herald, and some of the in-game pictures of some ghouls do so as well. The in-game sprites can vary a bit, and ghouls can be an array of colors, from a peach-like skin tone to light or dark green. We have been going through the games and their lore chronologically, but between Fallout Tactics and Fallout 3, we have canceled games, Fallout Brotherhood of Steel, and the Fallout Bible to take a peek at. The Fallout Bible, despite the authoritative name, is not the arbiter of Fallout canon. It was an ongoing project by one of the Fallout developers, Chris Avallone, to combine facts from the games with his behind-the-scenes experience and access to other Fallout developers to try and flesh out the lore. Therefore, it is very important to understand that any claim in the Bible, if it is not substantiated by Fallout 1, 2, or Tactics, that it could very well not be canon. Said simply, tread carefully and always check sources. The ghoul lore that is added by the Bible comes in a few categories. One is establishing dates for when certain things happened, like when Necropolis was formed. The role of radiation and FEV in causing mutations is covered with different thoughts presented by 2 different developers. Harold and his condition is talked about, and lastly, lore related to an area called Dayglow is spoken of, which was first mentioned in a holotape from Fallout 2, but not in any great detail. Bible Issue 0 consists of the first 3 Bible versions put together and gives us some dates for important ghoul-related events. Vault 12, found underneath Necropolis, had its vault door purposefully not to close all the way, allowing radiation to leak into the vault and affect the vault dwellers. Necropolis is founded 61 years later in 2138 by the Vault's ghoulified survivors. They were led by the original Vault Overseer until 2084, when Set wrested control of Necropolis from him, and he is never heard of again. In 2157, the Master learns of the location of Vault 12, and sends super mutants there to try and recover the Vault Dwellers, or Prime Normals as he calls them, not weird, in order to expose them to FEV and create more super mutants. But they are disappointed to find that all the residents of Vault 12 have turned into ghouls. In 2162, the Vault Dweller recovers the chip from Necropolis and fixes their water pump, but we aren't given a date for the sacking of the city. This information is interesting because the ghouls being from Vault 12 is not explicitly stated by them or anyone else in the first Fallout. Really, it's just inferred. The fact that the vault was designed to not seal properly as part of an experiment, and this is what led to them becoming ghouls, is also not hinted at all in either Fallout or Fallout 2. Fallout 2 was when the idea that vaults had an ulterior motive with experiments came into being. Some Fallout 2 events get a date now, like Broken Hills being established in 2185 by a group of humans, ghouls, and super mutants, and in 2235, Gecko, which had a small community of ghouls already, gets a sudden influx of ghoul migrants, and they get the nuclear plant working shortly after. In 2238, Harold makes his way to Gecko and becomes the leader of the community. In another part of Fallout Bible Issue 0, Chris Avallone says that all those that were to become ghouls were infected with FEV when the West Tech facility that housed a substantial amount of FEV was hit in the Great War and sent the virus airborne. This, mixed with radiation exposure, is what caused the ghouls to become what they are. In Bible number 5, another developer, Chris Taylor, agrees with Avalon, stating that ghouls are the result of a little bit of FEV and a lot of radiation, whereas super mutants are the result of a lot of FEV and no or a tiny bit of radiation damage. Tim Kaine, the producer of the first Fallout, disagrees with both Avalon and Taylor, and in the same Bible entry says that FEV and radiation just don't mix, meaning that ghouls would have to be the result of radiation alone. While this specific disagreement doesn't come up in later Fallouts, we can infer from the world which side Bethesda ends up siding with. Harold is discussed by Avalon, Taylor, and Kaine in issue number 5 as well, because fans are not quite sure whether to consider him a ghoul or not. Avalon believes that Harold is not a ghoul, but some other type of mutant, despite looking like one and being called a ghoul in game. Taylor says that Harold is both a ghoul and also a little special, but doesn't really elaborate further. Kaine says that he had always treated Harold as a ghoul, just not a necropolis one. He also said that since FEV and radiation don't mix, that Harold has to be one or the other, and that Kaine thinks that he is a ghoul. Bible number 5 then goes on to give more details surrounding Dayglow, which is a state within the NCR. It is located north and west of the Glow, and ghouls moved there after Necropolis was destroyed. They started to make a fairly good living, going in and scavenging technology from the West Tech facility. Their immunity to radiation granting them easy access to tradable tech that most others would have a hard time getting a hold of. Let's remember these details from the Bible, which was written and published in 2002, well before Bethesda had acquired the Fallout license. Van Buren was the project name for Interplay's planned Fallout 3 that was never released. There is a lot that I can go into with the lore additions this game would have had, but since this is already going to be a big video, I will save in-depth discussion of Van Buren details and instead just go over the salient points. Although this game never came to be, it is worth looking at because you'll never know when you will see these ideas or concepts pop up again in the future. A ghoul-only community known as the Reservation would have been a big location for the player, and led by a leader who believed in ghoul supremacy. Yeah, that's back. He is preparing to strike out against nearby groups of humans since ghouls suffer intense discrimination from them, and they believe a preemptive strike is the best way to not get wiped out first. The ghouls are heavily involved in research, and the most important work is the attempt to create what are called born ghouls. The ghouls of the reservation believe that the only thing holding them back is their inability to reproduce naturally. After a lot of experimentation, they have had 4 successful attempts, and these reborn ghouls are quite a bit different from all others. Their sprite shows them as a blue color. They are usually lean but very strong. They have all the attributes of a ghoul, meaning radiation resistance and prolonged life, but their lesions, patches of hair, and exposed bone form patterns on the skin, almost like there's a purpose behind them. Van Buren would have also featured a type of ghoul called an Endless Walker. They were ghouls that were banished from the reservation and were transformed by radiation, the relentless sun, and other types of degradation. Their skin hardens like leather armor, their fingers become claw-like, and they completely lose their humanity and ability to think and reason. They would have always been hostile, since they only act on instinct, sharing similarities with the crazed ghouls of Fallout 2. These are the details known from Van Buren design documents that have relevance to our examination and discussion of ghoul lore. Fallout Brotherhood of Steel. Yes, the pinnacle of the Fallout series had its own take on ghouls. Just to clarify, this game has been specifically said to not be canon, so please keep that in mind. Brotherhood of Steel is the first and only game to allow the player character to be a ghoul, and this ghoul named Kaine originally came from Necropolis. Kaine is resistant to radiation damage, but not immune, which is very different from earlier games, and he will take damage from radiation. His 2 greatest powers, however, are his handsomeness and his amazing Naruto run. Ghouls are found in a city called Los, who are split between a group of friendly ghouls who ghoulified as a result of the Great War, and a group of hostile ghouls that were formed much later when the secret vault that lies below Los exploded and ghoulified a number of former residents. The hostile ghouls established an anti-technology religion and society, making them the opposite of the Brotherhood of Steel, and they are called the Church of the Lost. Ghouls are able to run and fight with weapons. They all seem to have their mental faculties, demonstrating this by following orders or direct communication. There are glowing ones that hang out in the most irradiated areas that can cause radiation poisoning on contact. The actual ghoul models are hard to make out, but the concept art shows that ghouls are not just decaying, they seem to also have mutated. It's like a hunchback venom with horse hooves. I don't know what to make of that. Really, the only other interesting ghoul-related thing about the Brotherhood of Steel is that good old Harold is back. He sounds like an old hillbilly, and there is an optional quest to help him find all the body parts that have fallen off and are just laying somewhere. Brotherhood of Steel seems to think he is a ghoul since he came to Los to live amongst the ghouls, and when the player approaches him, the game classifies him as a ghoul wanderer. Let's look at what we know about some cancelled Fallout projects. Fallout Extreme was a proposed game that never made it all that far before it was abandoned. There is no concept art to give us an idea of what ghouls might have looked like, but the game would have included ghoulish refugees, but we don't know much more than that. Since part of this game was to take place in China, could some of these ghouls have been in or from China? Project V13 was the name shared by two proposed Fallout Online games that also never made it. We get some concept art of what ghouls would have looked like, and honestly, these are some of the nicest looking ghouls in the whole series. The female is standing up straight, full head of hair, and nary a pus-filled necrotic spot on the skin. These would have been a pretty big visual deviation from ghouls as we know them. A planned pen and paper RPG called Fallout D20 was being developed, but because Bethesda acquired the rights during the development process, the game had to pivot toward its own post-apocalyptic RPG. We have an image for the ghouls that were intended, and the image is probably the most zombie-like that we have seen so far. Also, let me point out that once again, the concept art shows the ghoul missing the right eye with some scar tissue stretched across the orbital cavity. How many games have done this now? Harold in the first Fallout, set in the first Fallout, Fallout Tactics concept and in-game art, Fallout Brotherhood of Steel concept art, and now Fallout D20. Seriously, what is up with ghouls and their right eye? And so we have made it through the Interplay period. All the games, unreleased games, and incomplete projects, and how they each choose to portray ghouls and add to or change ghoul lore. We are halfway there because the next 4 games add a lot to ghoul lore. And I just want to give you a little primer for the next video. Until fully researching ghoul lore, I didn't realize how much Fallout 3 talked about ghouls. It is possibly the game that is most interested in exploring ghouls and the ghoul condition compared to any other game, even the first Fallout. Look forward to that, and I want to say thank you for spending some time here with me today, and a big thank you to my awesome patrons. Their contributions help a lot, and you can't buy your way into Adam's presence, but that won't stop these guys from trying. If you want to join my Patreon, check out the video description and get some rewards like playing Fallout 76 with us. Adam bless you all. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you soon.